Grease-burnt rosemary and stale bear hung thick in the air, clinging to Nora's polyester uniform like a bad habit. Tuesday nights at Carmine's Chop House were graves. The kind of slow, suffocating shifts where the wall clock seemed to tick backward, and the drip of the coffee maker sounded like a metronome for the dying. She shifted her weight, a sharp ache, shooting up from the balls of her feet through her calves, the cheap rubber soles of her shoes doing absolutely nothing against the unforgiving cracked linoleum. Rain lashed against the front windows, blurring the neon signs of the street outside into smeared streaks of red and blue. Nora picked at a peeling edge of black nail polish, fighting the urge to pull out a cigarette. She didn't have time to smoke. Footsteps sounded at the front entrance, heavy, deliberate, accompanied by the wet squeak of leather on tile. Dominic Gallo walked in, bringing the smell of cold rain and wet wool with him. He didn't swagger. He didn't look around with the predatory glare of a man who owned the city, though everyone knew he practically did. He just looked exhausted. His charcoal overcoat was heavy with water, his shoulders hunched slightly, and a dark bruise sat high on his left cheekbone, turning an ugly shade of violet under the restaurant's harsh fluorescent lighting. Nora didn't flinch. She just grabbed a fresh linen napkin and a heavy ceramic mug. Working in a neighborhood bleeding into Gallo territory meant you learned to be invisible. You poured the coffee, you didn't look too closely at the stains on their cuffs, and you absolutely never asked about the bruised knuckles. He slid into booth 4, the far corner back to the wall-clear line of sight, to both the front door and the kitchen. Always booth 4, Black Nora said, approaching the table. Her voice was flat, gravelly from disuse. Dominic didn't look up from the damp wood of the table. He just grunted, stripping off leather gloves, finger by finger. Yeah. Keep it coming tonight, Nora. She poured the coffee. The dark liquid steamed, smelling sharply of over-roasted beans and copper. As she reached across to set down the small silver pitcher of cream he never used, her elbow clipped the edge of the heavy salt shaker. It tipped, rolled, and plummeted over the edge of the table. Shit, she muttered. A genuine slip. Her brain was fuzzy, sleep-deprived from a double shift to make rent. Leave it, Dominic said, his voice a low rumble. Boss'll dock my pay if it shatters, Nora replied, already dropping to her knees. The floor down there was sticky, a gross concoction of spilled soda floor wax and decades of neglect. She reached blindly under the heavy oak table, her fingers grazing the rough iron of the pedestal base. She found the glass shaker gripping its familiar ribbed texture. But her knuckles brushed something else. Something taped to the underside of the table. Nora froze. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the low hum of the refrigerator, the clattering of pans in the back, seemed to drop away, replaced by the rushing sound of her own blood in her ears. She turned her head. In the shadows beneath the heavy oak tabletop, illuminated only by the faint, ambient light bouncing off the scuffed floor, was a block of grey putty. Embedded in it were wires. Red. Yellow. Blue. They snaked into a small digital receiver. A tiny red light blinked. Blink, blink. No sound. Just that silent, rhythmic pulse. The smell of something chemical, sweet like marzipan, but sharp enough to burn the back of her throat, suddenly overpowered the scent of old floor wax. C4. She'd grown up with brothers who played with fire. She knew what explosives smelled like. Her breath hitched a pathetic, sharp sound that caught in her throat. Self-preservation screamed at her to crawl backward, to stand up, to drop her apron, and run out the back door into the alley. Dominic Gallo was a marked man. Being near him was a death sentence. She was just a waitress. She was 32, drowning in debt and violently alone. She didn't owe him anything, but her hands were shaking. She stared at the blinking red light. It wasn't a timer. It was a remote receiver, waiting for a signal. Whoever placed it was likely waiting for confirmation that Dominic was seated, waiting to push a button. Nora's chest squeezed tight, a painful knot of terror and an irritating, undeniable surge of conscience. She hated her conscience. It had never paid a single bill. She clutched the salt shaker, her knuckles white, and forced herself to push up from the floor. She stood, her knees cracking. The blood rushed from her head, making the room spin for a nauseating second. Dominic was looking at his phone, his thumb swiping absently. He reached for the coffee mug. Nora stepped in close. Too close. She invaded his personal space, her hip pressing against the edge of the table. She leaned down, pretending to wipe a non-existent spill near his saucer. Her hands were trembling violently now. "Look under your table," she whispered. Her voice wasn't heroic. It was a fractured, desperate croak. Dominic's thumb stopped moving. He didn't jump. He didn't look up at her. The muscles in his jaw tightened, a rigid line forming beneath his stubble. The air between them instantly turned to ice. "What did you just say?" He murmured the words, barely moving his lips. "Look. Under." "Your table." Nora repeated, her voice cracking. Sweat pricked her hairline, cold and sharp. She kept wiping the dry table, the rag squeaking against the wood. "Red light. Wires. Don't move the table. Someone's watching." She swallowed hard, tasting bile. She locked eyes with him then. His dark eyes were wide, the pupils blown. For a split second, Dominic Gallo, the terrifying underboss of the city's worst syndicate, looked entirely pathetically human. He looked terrified. Dominic's breathing stopped. The ceramic mug in his hand hovered an inch above the saucer, suspended in mid-air. He didn't slam it down. He didn't bark an order. He carefully, painstakingly lowered the mug until porcelain met porcelain with a soft clink. Nora watched a bead of sweat break out at his temple, sliding down his cheek to trace the edge of the purple bruise. The scent of his cologne, something sharp and woody, suddenly smelled sour, tainted by the unmistakable stench of acute fear. "How big?" he asked. The question was a ghost of a sound, completely devoid of the gravelly authority he usually commanded. "Size of a brick," Nora whispered, back her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her head down, scrubbing the rag against a stubborn stain on the wood, making herself look busy, look normal. Every second felt like wading through wet cement. Taped to the iron stem, Dominic's hand drifted off the table. He didn't look down. He stared straight ahead at the rain-lashed window, his expression painfully blank. Nora saw his fingers twitch slightly as they disappeared beneath the edge of the booth. He found it. She knew the exact moment his fingertips brushed the chemical putty. His entire body went rigid. A sharp, ragged inhale soared through his teeth. It wasn't a cool, calculated reaction. It was the visceral flinch of a man realizing he was sitting on his own grave. "Motherfucker." He breathed out, his voice trembling. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if the explosive had teeth. He looked at Nora. Really looked at her. His eyes were entirely stripped of pretense. There was no tough guy left, just a cornered animal calculating its odds of survival. "It's a receiver," Dominic muttered, his eyes darting to the front window. "No timer. They're waiting for the trigger, which means they have eyes on the room." Nora followed his gaze. The street outside was a blur of dark sedans and passing headlights. Anyone out there could be holding a detonator. "I'm leaving," Nora said, her voice shaking violently. "I'm walking to the kitchen and I'm going out the back." "No!" Dominic snapped, a raw, desperate edge to his voice. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was entirely too tight, painful, the fingers digging into her bones. "If you run, they'll know we found it. They'll blow it right now. You leave, I die. If I stay, I die," Nora hissed, trying to wrench her arm away, tears of pure panic stinging the corners of her eyes. She wasn't built for this. She just wanted to go home and feed her cat. She tugged, but his grip was like an iron vice. 10 seconds, Dominic pleaded. The word felt completely unnatural coming from his mouth. "Just give me 10 seconds to think. Stand here. Block the window's view of me." Nora stopped pulling. She stood rigid, her back to the glass, effectively shielding Dominic's upper body from the street. She was a human shield. The realization made her stomach heave. She tasted the bitter tang of old coffee in the back of her throat. "Okay." She breathed, her legs shaking so badly she felt her knees knocking together. "Okay. Think fast." Dominic's eyes darted around the empty restaurant. He looked at the kitchen doors. He looked at the heavy oak bar. He was sweating profusely now, his chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. "Listen to me," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to force a calm he clearly didn't possess. "When I say move, you drop. You don't run. You drop straight down. The heavy oak of this table might take the brunt of the shrapnel if we're flat on the floor. Understand? You said they have eyes on us." Nora countered, her voice pitching up. "If we drop, they hit the button." "They're coming inside," Dominic said, his eyes fixed on the front door. Nora turned her head slightly. A black Lincoln Town car had pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the heavy rain. The rear doors popped open. 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing raincoats. They were wearing dark suits, their hands shoved deep inside their jackets. They weren't here to press a button from afar. They wanted to make sure it was done. They wanted to watch. "Oh God," Nora whimpered. The sound was pathetic, but she didn't care. The reality of her impending death was suffocating her, pressing down on her chest until she couldn't pull air into her lungs. "Nora, look at me," Dominic said fiercely. He let go of her wrist and grabbed her apron, pulling her slightly closer. "We are going to move. We are going to survive this. But you have to do exactly what I tell you." The bell above the diner door chimed, a cheerful, innocent sound that contrasted violently with the icy dread filling the room. The 2 men stepped inside. Water dripped from their slicked-back hair onto the scuffed linoleum. The taller one sporting a jagged scar across his chin, locked eyes with Dominic. He smiled, a cold, empty stretching of lips. He pulled his right hand from his jacket. He was holding a small black plastic device. A detonator. "Now!" Dominic roared. It wasn't a graceful dive. It was a messy, chaotic scramble, born of pure, unadulterated terror. Dominic kicked the heavy table hard, attempting to flip it. The solid oak barely lifted 2 inches before slamming back down, too heavy to budge. Nora didn't think. Her legs gave out. She collapsed backward, her shoulder slamming painfully against the sharp edge of a neighboring chair. She hit the sticky floor hard, the breath driven from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Dominic threw himself sideways out of the booth, hitting the linoleum with a heavy thud, twisting his body to reach inside his coat. The tall man pressed his thumb down on the black plastic button. Silence stretched thin and brittle across the span of a single heartbeat. Nora lay curled on the sticky floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest, eyes squeezed shut. She braced for the concussive wave, for the heat, for the tearing of wood and flesh. She waited to be unmade. Nothing happened. There was no deafening roar, no blinding flash, only the persistent, cheerful hum of the neon beer sign in the window and the frantic, shallow gasps tearing in and out of her own throat. Under the table, the tiny red light continued its rhythmic, mocking pulse. blink. Her clumsy scramble for the salt shaker, her knuckles scraping the rough putty. She hadn't just felt the bomb, she had snagged it. A cheap, thin yellow wire had pulled loose from its housing by a fraction of a millimeter. It was a stupid, blind accident. A slip of an underpaid waitress in cheap rubber shoes. Scarface stared at the black plastic detonator in his hand. His brow furrowed a flicker of genuine confusion, breaking his cold facade. He pressed his thumb down again. Harder this time. Click. Dominic didn't wait for the third attempt. He fired from the floor. He hadn't drawn his weapon with a smooth, cinematic flourish. It had caught on the lining of his heavy wool coat, forcing him to yank it free with an ugly, panicked jerk. The noise in the enclosed space was catastrophic. It wasn't a neat pop. It was a physical blow, a concussive slap against Nora's eardrums that made the world instantly ring with a high, sustained whine. The first bullet missed Scarface completely. It slammed into the glass pastry display case behind him, detonating a shower of tempered glass and powdered sugar over the linoleum. The second man, a broad-shouldered brute in a cheap trench coat, reacted instantly. He didn't aim. He just pointed a sawed-off shotgun toward the booth and pulled the trigger. The oak table exploded. Splinters the size of kitchen knives rained down. A heavy chunk of wood slammed into Nora's thigh, driving a sharp, breathless cry from her lips. She scrambled backward, like a crab slipping on the damp floor, her hands scraping through a mess of shattered coffee mugs, wet sugar, and shards of fiberglass. Gunpowder instantly choked the air. It smelled like sulfur and burnt hair masking the scent of stale coffee and grease. Dominic rolled his shoulder, slamming into the base of the counter. He swore a wet, guttural sound of pure exertion and fired twice more. One round caught the broad-shouldered man in the collarbone. The kinetic force threw the man backward against the heavy glass entrance door. He didn't fall gracefully. He collapsed into a messy, thrashing heap, his boots kicking uselessly against the welcome mat, smearing dark, thick blood across the glass. Scarface dropped the useless detonator. He drew a pistol from his waistband, dropping to one knee to make himself a smaller target. He fired blindly into the space behind the counter where Dominic had ducked. Bottles of cheap syrup exploded. Splatters of artificial maple rained down on Nora's arms, warm and horrifyingly similar to blood. She squeezed herself under the lip of the Waitress station, making herself as small as humanly possible. Dust drifted down from the acoustic ceiling tiles, coating her hair, getting into her eyes. She couldn't see. She could only hear the deafening, erratic thunder of gunfire, the shattering of ceramics, and the terrifying, wet sounds of bullets chewing through upholstery and plaster. This wasn't a calculated shootout. It was a chaotic, blind panic. "Move!" Dominic roared over the ringing in her ears. Nora didn't look up. She kept her face pressed against her knees. She was paralyzed. A primal, heavy weight pinned her to the floor. If she moved, she would die. A hand grabbed the back of her polyester collar, twisting the fabric until it choked her. Dominic hauled her upward, with brute, unceremonious force. He wasn't gentle. He dragged her out from under the station, her knees banging painfully against the cabinetry. "I said move, goddammit!" He coughed, his face pale, smeared with plaster dust and sweat. His eyes were wild. He looked nothing like the untouchable underboss of the Gallo family. He looked like a man frantically trying to outrun death. He shoved her toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. Nora stumbled her shoes, slipping on a slick puddle of spilled cream. She caught herself on the aluminum frame of the doorway, her fingers leaving bloody smears from the glass cuts on her palms. She pushed through the swinging doors. The kitchen was empty. The cook had bolted out the back the second the first shot rang out, leaving a burger patty hissing and spitting angrily on the flat-top grill. The smell of burning meat was nauseating. Behind them, the diner door chimed again. Reinforcements. Dominic shoved his back against the swinging kitchen doors, using his body weight to hold them shut. He fired blindly over his shoulder, the bullet punching a hole through the small circular window in the door. "The back exit!" He gasped, his chest heaving. "Go!" Rain hit Nora's face like tiny freezing needles the second she threw her shoulder against the heavy steel of the back door. She stumbled out into the alley, her cheap shoes sliding immediately on the slick, oil-stained asphalt. The night air was biting, but it was clean free of cordite dust and the cloying smell of artificial syrup. She fell hard against a stack of damp cardboard boxes, her breath coming in ragged, painful wheezes. She felt utterly hollowed out, her stomach clenching violently. She pitched forward, vomiting a harsh stream of bile and cold coffee onto the wet pavement. The metal door slammed open behind her, bouncing off the brick wall with a jarring clang. Dominic stumbled through. He didn't look back. He grabbed Nora's arm, the same wrist he had crushed earlier, and yanked her upright. "Don't stop!" He hissed, his voice tight with pain. "Keep walking." Nora tried to pull away, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling, bleeding hand. "I can't! Let go of me! I'm calling the police!" Dominic stopped. He turned to her, his grip tightening. In the dim, sickly yellow light of the alleyway street lamp, she finally saw the blood. It was a dark, spreading stain blooming across the left sleeve of his charcoal overcoat, heavy and wet. He wasn't standing straight. He was favoring his right side, his breath hitching slightly with every inhalation. "Call the cops and you're dead before sunrise," he stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a deeply exhausting statement of fact. "They saw your face. You were standing next to me. You found the bomb. In their minds, you're involved." "I'm a waitress!" Nora screamed, the sound echoing harshly off the brick walls. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally broke through her paralysis. "I served you coffee. That's it. Do you think they care?" Dominic snapped back, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly rasp. He leaned in, crowding her against the cold, wet brick. He smelled like wet wool, blood, and fear. "Do you think the men who just shot up a diner care about your W-2s? You are a loose end. And the only reason you're breathing right now is because I am standing between you and them. So walk." He pushed away from her, stumbling slightly, as his left leg gave out for a fraction of a second. He cursed, clutching his shoulder, and started walking quickly down the alley, away from the flashing sirens that were just beginning to wail in the distance. Nora stared at his back. The rain was washing the plaster dust from his coat, leaving only the dark, heavy wetness of the blood. She looked back at the steel door of the diner. She could go back inside, hide in the walk-in freezer, wait for the uniforms to arrive. But Dominic's words clung to her like the cold rain. "They saw your face." She knew how this city worked. The cops were on payrolls. The uniforms sweeping the diner would be writing reports dictated by men in much nicer suits than the ones who just tried to kill them. If she stayed, she was a liability to someone. A sob tore from her throat, jagged and pathetic. She hated him. She hated him for walking into her section. She hated him for sitting at booth 4. She wiped her eyes, mixing tears with rain and dirt, and started running. She caught up to him at the end of the alley. They spilled out onto a side street 3 blocks away from the neon lights of Carmine's. The road was deserted, the gutters rushing with muddy water. Dominic was leaning heavily against a parked, rusted-out sedan. His head bowed the rain, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He was fumbling with something in his right pocket. "We need a car," Nora gasped, leaning against a street lamp, her lungs burning as if she'd inhaled fiberglass. "Your guys. Don't you have guys?" My guys put the bomb under the table, Dominic said. He pulled a slim metal tool from his pocket, a tension wrench. It was an inside hit. My car out front is a coffin. He slid the tension wrench into the lock of the battered sedan. His hands, usually so steady, were shaking violently. He missed the pins. He swore a long, vicious string of profanities and hit the window with the butt of his gun. The glass didn't shatter. It cracked a spiderweb of thick white lines. He hit it again, harder. The glass gave way, falling inward onto the driver's seat. He reached in, unlocked the door, and slid inside, leaving streaks of blood on the grey fabric. Nora stood on the curb, paralyzed again. The reality of getting into a stolen car with a bleeding Mafia boss was a line she had never thought she would cross. It was a point of no return. Dominic popped the steering column cover off with a violent snap of plastic. He didn't look at her. "Get in," he grunted, stripping 2 wires with his teeth. "Or stay here and freeze. I really don't care anymore." Nora looked down the street. The distant wail of sirens was growing louder, spiraling closer. She looked at the blood on her hands. She opened the passenger door and got in. The car smelled like stale smoke and wet dog. It was the worst smell in the world, and right then, it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Sparks showered down onto the floorboard as the engine finally caught, coughing out a thick cloud of blue exhaust. Dominic slammed the sedan into gear with the heel of his hand. Tires spun uselessly against the wet asphalt for an agonizing second, before finding purchase, violently jerking the heavy car forward. Nora slammed back against the cracked vinyl passenger seat. She didn't bother looking for a seatbelt. Her hands were clamped tight around the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles bone white. Through the shattered driver's side window, wind and freezing rain blasted into the cabin, instantly soaking Dominic's ruined coat and stinging Nora's face. Every street lamp they passed cast an alternating strobe-like glare across Dominic's profile. His skin had lost its olive warmth, taking on the waxy, translucent hue of cheap parchment. He was driving entirely with his right hand, his left arm hanging useless and heavy at his side. Blood pooled in the creases of his leather seat, dripping steadily onto the rubber floor mat, with a rhythmic, sickening pat, pat, pat. He took a sharp right turn, the sedan's worn shocks groaning in protest. They fishtailed slightly. Nora let out a sharp, involuntary hiss, bracing for an impact that didn't come. Dominic overcorrected the steering wheel, sliding through his wet palm, before he finally straightened them out on a dark, industrial stretch of road. "You're bleeding everywhere," Nora said. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, thin, reedy, and vibrating with suppressed hysteria. Dominic didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the rear-view mirror, tracking every set of headlights that appeared in the gloom behind them. Astute observation. "Look in the glove box. Tell me if there's a rag. Fast food napkins. Anything." Nora popped the latch. The plastic door fell open, spilling a mess of ancient registration papers, a rusted tire gauge, and a handful of petrified ketchup packets onto her knees. She shoved her hand into the dark cavity, her fingers grazing something soft. She pulled out a wadded-up, grease-stained McDonald's paper bag. "Just this," she muttered, holding it up like a piece of garbage. "Give it to me." She reached across the console, hesitating as her hand neared his chest. The smell of copper was overwhelming now, thick and hot, completely drowning out the stale cigarette smoke baked into the car's upholstery. Dominic snatched the crumpled paper from her shaking fingers. He shoved it clumsily beneath the lapel of his overcoat, pressing it hard against his left shoulder. A sharp, breathless groan tore through his teeth. His head dropped back against the headrest for a fraction of a second, his eyes squeezing shut. The car drifted ominously toward the concrete median. "Hey!" Nora yelled, reaching instinctively for the wheel. Dominic's eyes snapped open. He jerked the car back into the lane, his chest heaving. Sweat dripped from his chin, mixing with the rain, soaking his collar. "I'm fine," he rasped, though the tremor in his jaw violently contradicted the statement. "You're passing out," Nora fired back, panic sharpening her tone into a jagged edge. "Where are we going? You said your guys did this. Who do we call? Where is your backup?" Dominic let out a laugh that sounded more like a death rattle. "Backup? That's funny. The guy who walked into the diner. That was Leo. He's my right hand. He's the guy I call when I need backup." Nora stared at him, the horrifying reality of their situation sinking in. "Your own people are trying to kill you. Welcome to management," he grunted, shifting his weight. His face contorted, another wave of pain washing over his features. "My uncle runs the family. He's been paranoid for months, thinks I'm moving for his chair." I guess he finally decided to stop wondering. He hit the brakes too hard as a stray dog darted across the wet pavement. The sedan lurched, throwing Nora forward. Dominic cursed his right hand, slipping off the wheel entirely as he clutched his wounded shoulder. The car stalled the engine, dying with a pathetic shuddering clunk right in the middle of the desolate intersection. Rain drummed loudly against the tin roof. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, save for Dominic's ragged, wet breathing. He leaned his forehead against the steering wheel. He didn't try to restart the engine. He just sat there, his shoulders rising and falling in sharp, unnatural jerks. The paper bag he'd shoved against his wound was already saturated dark blood, seeping through the greasy brown paper and staining his fingers. Dominic, Nora whispered. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. At the diner, he was always just Table 4 or Boss. He didn't answer. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She looked out the cracked windshield. They were in the warehouse district. Empty loading docks, rusted chain-link fences, completely devoid of life. It was a perfect place to die quietly. She reached over and grabbed his right shoulder, shaking him roughly. "Don't do this. You do not get to drag me into a shootout and then die on me in a stolen car. Move over." Dominic groaned, a low animal sound. He turned his head, slightly peering at her through half-closed, feverish eyes. What move over Nora demanded, unbuckling her seatbelt and pushing herself up awkward and frantic in the cramped space. "You can't drive. I'm driving. You don't even know where we're going." "I know a place," Nora said, her voice dropping into a cold, hard register she didn't know she possessed. "It's a dump, but it's off the grid. Now climb over the console before I push you out into the street and leave you here." Dominic stared at her for a long, heavy second. He didn't argue. With agonizing slowness, he dragged his body over the center console, leaving a wide, wet smear of crimson across the cheap plastic. Cricket screamed over the dull roar of the nearby highway. The Pines Motor Lodge sat off a forgotten access road, an absolute monument to urban decay. Its neon sign had long ago shattered, leaving only the rusted iron skeleton of a pine tree jutting into the bleak night sky. Nora threw the sedan into park behind a dumpster overflowing with soggy drywall. She cut the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and immediately claustrophobic. She looked over at the passenger seat. Dominic was slumped against the passenger door, his head resting awkwardly against the glass. His eyes were open, but they were glassy, unfocused. The front of his coat was entirely black with blood. "Hey," Nora said, tapping his knee. "We're here." He blinked slowly, turning his head toward her. "Where's here?" His words slurred, thick and clumsy. "Purgatory," Nora replied, pulling the keys from the ignition. "I used to live here for a few weeks when I got evicted. The guy who runs the desk, Gary, is legally blind, and cares about cash, nothing else. No cameras. No questions. She got out into the rain. It had reduced to a steady, freezing drizzle. She walked around to the passenger side and yanked the heavy door open. Dominic practically fell out his knees, buckling the second his Italian leather shoes hit the muddy gravel. Nora caught him groaning as his dead weight crushed against her side. He smelled awful, a sickening cocktail of iron sweat and wet dirt. She slung his good arm over her shoulders, wrapping her arm tightly around his waist. "Walk," she ordered, her teeth chattering. "Put one foot in front of the other. Do not pass out in this parking lot." The walk to room 14 took 5 minutes. It felt like an hour. Every step was a brutal negotiation with gravity. Dominic dragged his feet, his breath hitching into sharp, wet gasps every time he jostled his shoulder. By the time Nora fumbled the cheap brass key into the lock, her own muscles were burning slick with a cold, terrified sweat. She kicked the door open and dragged him inside. The room smelled fiercely of stale beer, industrial bleach, and mildew. A single flickering bulb illuminated a sagging, full-sized bed, covered in a hideous brown and orange floral bedspread. Nora steered him toward the bed and let go. Dominic collapsed face first onto the mattress. He let out a muffled, agonizing yell, his good hand curling into the cheap fabric, tearing it. "Roll over," Nora said, locking the deadbolt and throwing the security chain across the door. She closed the heavy nicotine-stained curtains tight. Dominic didn't move. Nora walked over to the bed, her legs shaking so badly she felt like she was standing on a fault line. She grabbed his right shoulder and shoved him onto his back. He was ghastly pale. His lips carried a faint blue tint. "Coat off," she commanded, her voice cracking. She didn't wait for him to help. She grabbed his right lapel and pulled, sliding the heavy wet wool off his good arm. The left side was harder. The fabric was glued to his skin by congealed blood. Dominic grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Stop, stop! Just cut it!" Nora looked around the barren room. With what I don't exactly have trauma shears, she went into the tiny mold-speckled bathroom. She ripped open a small plastic package containing a complimentary razor and snapped the plastic head off, extracting the 2 thin, flimsy blades. She grabbed a stack of thin, scratchy white towels from the rack above the toilet. When she walked back into the room, Dominic was watching her, his dark eyes tracking her movements with a predatory, desperate intensity. Nora knelt beside the bed. She used the tiny razor blade to slice through the seams of his custom-tailored shirt, tearing the fabric the rest of the way with trembling, bloody fingers. The wound was ugly. It was high on his shoulder, just below the collarbone. A dark, jagged hole that was welling with fresh, bright red blood with every beat of his heart. Nora's stomach violently revolted. She clamped a hand over her mouth, tasting the sour remnant of the bile she'd thrown up in the alleyway. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the intense urge to run out the door, get back in the stolen car, and drive until she ran out of gas. "Breathe," Dominic rasped his voice, barely a whisper. Nora opened her eyes. He wasn't looking at his shoulder. He was looking directly at her. Through and through, he managed to say, his jaw clenching tight. "It didn't hit the artery or I'd be dead. Just pack it. Hard." Nora grabbed a clean white towel. She folded it into a thick square. Her hands hovered over his chest, trembling so violently she dropped the towel. She picked it up, frustrated tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, cutting tracks through the plaster dust on her cheeks. "I can't!" She sobbed a pathetic broken sound. "I'm just a waitress, Dominic. I serve coffee. I drop salt shakers. I can't do this." "Nora!" He reached up with his right hand, his fingers completely coated in his own blood, and wrapped them around her shaking hands. His skin was freezing. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "You found the wire," he said, his voice straining, forcing each word out through a wall of pain. "You got me out the back door. You drove the car. You are doing this. Put the towel on the hole and push." Nora swallowed hard. She nodded once. She pulled her hands out of his grip, placed the thick pad of the folded towel directly over the oozing bullet hole, and threw her entire body weight against it, pressing down as hard as she physically could. Dominic's back arched off the mattress. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat, echoing violently against the cheap motel walls. Dominic's scream shattered against the cheap acoustic tiles of the motel ceiling, echoing back down as a wet, rattling gasp. The sound didn't make Nora flinch. She was past flinching. She locked her elbows, driving her palms relentlessly into the blood-soaked towel over his collarbone. Her own breath tore through her teeth in ragged, uneven bursts. Underneath her hands, his body was a live wire of pure agony. His muscles seized his good hand, blindly seeking purchase and finding the torn edge of the floral bedspread, twisting it until his knuckles turned white. "Keep pressing," he choked out. The command was barely audible, drowned in a swamp of saliva and pain. Nora didn't answer. She couldn't. All her physical energy, every ounce of her focus, was channeled into gravity. She watched the stark white of the cheap motel towel turn a violent, heavy crimson. It blossomed outward from the center, a dark stain consuming the terry cloth with terrifying speed. It felt like holding back a river with a paper cup. Minutes bled into one another. The only sounds in room 14 were the steady metallic hum of the window, AC unit rattling in its casing, and the horrific wet drag of Dominic's breathing. Slowly the rigid tension in his chest began to slacken. His head lolled to the side, his cheek pressing into the mustard-yellow mattress pad where she had ripped the sheet away. His eyes fluttered shut. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Nora's chest. Hey, don't pass out!" She pushed harder, her arms shaking so violently she felt it in her teeth. "Dominic, open your eyes." He didn't move. His face was the color of old ash. Nora lifted her hands a fraction of an inch. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish, dark seep. It wasn't stopped, but it wasn't the terrifying pulse from before. She needed to bind it. She couldn't stand over him applying manual pressure for the next 10 hours. She backed away from the bed, wiping a streak of half-dried blood across her forehead with the back of her wrist. Her legs felt like hollow reeds. She stumbled toward the bathroom, her eyes frantically scanning the desolate space. No medical tape. No bandages, just the thin, scratchy towels and a half-empty roll of industrial toilet paper. She rushed back to the bed, the ripped floral bedspread. She grabbed the edge where Dominic had torn it and pulled with all her weight. The cheap polyester blend fabric gave way with a sickening rip. She tore it into 3 long, jagged strips. Approaching him again felt like approaching a wounded, sleeping dog. She didn't know if he would wake up and strike, or just die quietly. She slid one arm under his good shoulder, hauling his dead weight upward, just enough to slide the first strip of fabric beneath his back. He groaned a low, subconscious sound of protest, but remained limp. Nora worked with clumsy, frantic efficiency. She pulled the fabric tight across his chest, anchoring the bloody towel in place, and tied a crude, brutal knot right over his sternum. She repeated it with the second strip, binding his left arm tightly to his torso to immobilize the shoulder. When she was done, she stepped back. Her hands were painted in his blood. It was under her fingernails, smeared across her forearms, soaking into the cuffs of her polyester diner uniform. The smell of it Sharp metallic, like wet pennies and raw meat, filled the cramped room, entirely masking the stale cigarette smoke. Nora backed up until her shoulders hit the chipped plaster of the wall. She slid down her knees, pulling to her chest, and sat on the filthy stained carpet. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow to the back of the head. Her teeth began to chatter, clicking together so hard her jaw ached. She wrapped her arms around her shins, rocking slightly, staring at the man on the bed. He was the underboss, the man who owned the judges, the docks, the local precincts. Sitting in his booth at Carmine's, he was an untouchable force of nature. Now he was just a broken, bleeding liability, ruining a perfectly terrible motel room. She hated him. The intensity of the hatred surprised her. She wanted to stand up, unlock the door, and walk into the freezing rain. Let whoever was hunting him find him. Let the cops find him. Let him bleed out on the mustard-yellow mattress. She owed him nothing. He had dragged her into his war simply by walking through the diner doors. But she didn't move. She sat against the wall for hours. The neon light from a distant gas station bled through a crack in the curtains, painting a slash of toxic green across the foot of the bed. She listened to his breathing. It was shallow, occasionally catching on a wet cough that made his entire frame shudder. Sometime around 3 a.m, Dominic shifted. A sharp hiss of pain cut through the quiet. Nora's head snapped up. She had dozed off her chin, resting on her knees. Dominic's eyes were open, staring blankly at the water-stained ceiling. He brought his right hand up his fingers, brushing the crude makeshift bandages binding his chest. "You're still here," he rasped. His voice was completely destroyed, sounding like crushed gravel. "My car is blocked by a dumpster, and I don't have the keys." Nora lied. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic from earlier. Exhaustion had hollowed her out, leaving only a cold, bitter shell. Dominic slowly turned his head. His dark eyes found her in the shadows against the wall. The fever was setting in. She could see the unnatural glassy sheen in his pupils, even in the dim light. "You tied a square knot," he observed, his breathing hitched. "Impressive. I have 3 older brothers. They fought a lot." Nora didn't move from the floor. "You're burning up." The bleeding slowed, but the bullet is still in there, or it took pieces of your coat with it. "You're going to get an infection." "I've had worse," he muttered, closing his eyes again. "That's a stupid lie, and we both know it." Nora finally pushed herself up from the floor. Her joints screamed in protest. She walked to the tiny sink, grabbed the plastic ice bucket liner, and filled it with cold tap water. She wet a clean washcloth and walked back to the bed. She didn't ask permission. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning loudly, and pressed the cold, damp cloth to his forehead. Dominic flinched at the temperature change, but then leaned into it, letting out a long, shuddering exhale. "My uncle," he whispered, his voice drifting, losing its anchor to the room. "Vincent." He didn't want to wait for the old man to die. He wanted the chair now. Nora kept the cloth pressed to his skin. "I don't care about your family drama, Dominic. I care about how I get my life back." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle that quickly dissolved into a cough. "You don't. That life died the second you looked under table 4. He opened his eyes, pinning her with a look of absolute, devastating certainty. "Vincent knows you saw Leo. He knows you saw his face. You're a witness to an internal hit. There is no version of this where he lets you go back to pouring coffee." Nora's hand stilled on his forehead. The cold truth of his words settled into her bones, heavier than the fatigue. She wasn't just hiding. She was hunted. Morning arrived without fanfare, a sickly bruised grey light creeping through the gap in the heavy curtains. It illuminated the absolute squalor of room 14 with unforgiving clarity. The dust motes dancing in the stale air, the peeling wallpaper, the massive dried blood stain dominating the center of the bed. Nora was standing by the window, peering through a half-inch slit in the drapes. The parking lot was empty, save for the stolen shattered sedan and a rusted pickup truck missing its front left tire. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, freezing fog that clung to the asphalt. Behind her, the bed springs shrieked. Dominic was trying to sit up. It was a brutal, ugly process. He leveraged his entire weight onto his right elbow, his face contorting in a silent, agonizing mask as he dragged his torso upright. Sweat immediately beaded on his upper lip. The crude polyester bandages around his chest were stiff with dried blood, but no fresh crimson was seeping through. "Don't tear the stitches," Nora said, not turning away from the window. "Oh, wait, you don't have any." Dominic let out a breathless grunt, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He sat there hunched over his head, hanging between his shoulders. His skin was pale and waxy, but the glassy, feverish look in his eyes had subsided slightly. "I need my coat," he rasped, staring at the floor. Nora turned. She pointed to a lump of ruined, blood-soaked charcoal wool piled in the corner by the television stand. "It's garbage. It weighs 10 pounds and smells like a slaughterhouse." Inside pocket, he insisted, his jaw tight. "Bring it!" Nora rolled her eyes, a deeply ingrained habit that felt absurdly out of place given the circumstances. She walked over, pinched the heavy wool between two fingers, and dragged it to the bed. It left a faint, rusty smear on the carpet. Dominic reached into the inner breast pocket with his good hand. He pulled out a thick wad of cash, hundreds bound in a rubber band, and a cheap black plastic cell phone. A burner. He tossed the cash onto the mattress and flipped the phone open. "Who are you calling?" Nora asked, crossing her arms over her stained uniform. "I thought you said your own people set you up." "Leo set me up. Vincent gave the order." Dominic punched in a number with his thumb, his movements stiff and painful. "That doesn't mean the whole family turned. It just means I have to be very careful who I wake up." He held the phone to his ear. The silence stretched. Nora watched the muscles in his neck jump. "Silvio," Dominic said into the receiver. His voice was low instantly, shedding the vulnerability of the wounded man and adopting the chilling, authoritative cadence of the underboss. "Shut up and listen. It's me." Nora watched him work, even half-naked, bound in torn motel sheets, bleeding and hiding in a shithole off the interstate. The man commanded the air in the room. Leo flipped. "Carmine's is gone. Yeah, I'm hit, but I'm breathing." Dominic paused, his eyes narrowing, as he listened to the tinny voice on the other end. "No, you don't send anyone. You don't tell a soul I called. You go to the lockup on 4th and Pike, the blue unit. Grab the duffel bag, the keys to the Audi, and whatever medical supplies you can strip from the back room. You bring it to the Pines off exit 14. Room 14. Another pause. Dominic's expression darkened. "Because if you don't, Silvio and I survive this, I will personally pull your teeth out with a pair of pliers. Be here in an hour." He snapped the phone shut. He looked up at Nora. The effort of the phone call had cost him. He was swaying slightly, his right hand gripping the edge of the mattress to keep from toppling forward. "He coming?" Nora asked, her tone entirely devoid of optimism. 50-50, Dominic replied honestly, dropping the phone onto the pile of cash. "He might bring a medical kit and a car. He might bring Vincent and a shotgun. We'll know in 60 minutes. Nora stared at him. "You are out of your mind. We need to leave. Right now." We steal that truck outside. The truck has no tire, Nora. Dominic cut her off, his voice flat. And my stolen car has a shattered window, blood everywhere, and the steering column ripped out. It's a beacon for every patrol cop in a 50-mile radius. We are not mobile. We wait. I am not dying in this room. Nora stated, her voice rising the thin veneer of calm she'd built overnight, cracking instantly. I am not sitting here waiting for a hit squad because you placed a bad bet on a phone call. She spun around, marching toward the door. She reached for the deadbolt. Nora! The sharp, commanding crack of his voice stopped her hand an inch from the brass lock. Look on the bed, he said. She turned her head slowly. Dominic hadn't moved to stop her. Instead, he was pointing his right index finger at the mattress. Next to the stack of hundreds and the burner phone lay a matte black compact pistol. He must have pulled it from the coat pocket alongside the phone. He wasn't aiming it at her. It was just lying there, a heavy, silent anchor in the room. If you walk out that door, you have nothing, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You have blood on your clothes. You have no car. You have $50 in tips in your apron. Vincent's men are looking for a waitress. The cops are looking for a waitress. You take 2 steps down that highway, and you belong to them. He picked up the wad of cash and tossed it onto the floor at her feet. Or you pick that up. $10,000. You wait 60 minutes. If Silvio shows, we get a clean car, clean clothes, and we disappear until I figure out how to put a bullet in my uncle's head. When that's done, you walk away. Nora looked at the cash lying on the stained carpet. It was more money than she made in a year. It represented rent safety, a ticket out of the grinding poverty that kept her trapped at Carmine's. She looked from the money to the gun, and finally to Dominic. His eyes were dark, devoid of pity or apology. He was offering her a transaction, the only language his world understood. 60 minutes, Nora said, her voice shaking with a potent mixture of terror and absolute furious resolve. She knelt down, picking up the stack of hundreds. The rubber band snapped sharply against her fingers. If he brings a shotgun, I'm hiding behind you. Dominic let out a huff of air that might have been a laugh if his chest wasn't destroyed. Deal. 52 minutes crawled by with the agonizing pace of a slow bleeding wound. Dust drifted through the solitary shaft of grey light cutting across the motel room. Nora sat cross-legged on the floor, her back pressed flush against the vibrating casing of the window air conditioning unit. The $10,000 sat heavy in her lap, a thick, dirty brick of salvation and damnation. Her thumbs traced the edges of the bills, feeling the raised ink, the grime of circulation. It smelled like mint, sweat and copper. On the bed, Dominic hadn't moved. His breathing was a wet, rhythmic rasp that scraped against the silence. His right hand remained loosely draped over the matte black pistol. His eyes were closed, but the rigid line of his jaw told Nora he wasn't sleeping. He was conserving whatever meager battery life his body had left. Gravel crunched outside. It wasn't the heavy grinding roll of the garbage truck from an hour ago. It was the slow, deliberate crawl of tires rolling over the cracked pavement, easing into a parking spot just out of sight. Nora's breath caught. She scrambled up from the floor, her rubber-soled shoes slipping slightly on the carpet. She shoved the brick of cash into the deep pocket of her apron, the weight of it banging against her thigh. She flattened herself against the peeling wallpaper next to the window, peeking through the narrow slit in the drapes. A sleek, slate-grey Audi idled near the ruined sedan. Raindrops beaded on its waxed hood. The engine purred a low, expensive hum that sounded entirely alien in the squalor of the Pines motor lodge. A man stepped out. He was short, barrel-chested, wearing a tan windbreaker that hung open to reveal the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster. He didn't look toward the room right away. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes lingering on the shattered window of Dominic's stolen car, before pulling a heavy black canvas duffel bag from the back seat. "It's one guy," Nora whispered, her voice a tight, high string. "Tan jacket, carrying a bag. Silvio." Dominic exhaled. The relief in his voice was microscopic, immediately buried under a thick layer of physical pain as he forced his eyes open and gripped the gun tighter. "If anyone else steps out of that car, drop to the floor." Footsteps approached the door. 3 sharp raps. A pause. 2 more. "Open it," Dominic ordered. He dragged the gun up, resting the barrel on his bent knee, aiming directly at the deadbolt. Nora's hands shook as she reached for the brass chain. It rattled obnoxiously against the frame. She threw the deadbolt and pulled the door inward, instantly stepping back. Silvio pushed inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The room immediately smelled of wet asphalt and expensive cologne. He dropped the heavy duffel onto the floor with a dull thud. His dark eyes flicked to Nora, a cold, dismissive assessment, before snapping to the bed. He stopped. The tough guy facade fractured for a split second. "Jesus Christ, Dom, you look like ground meat." "Flattery won't get you a raise," Dominic rasped, lowering the pistol an inch, but not dropping it. "Did you bring the kit?" "Everything you asked for." Silvio knelt, unzipping the canvas bag. He pulled out a box of heavy-duty gauze, a bottle of medical-grade saline, and a staple gun. "Leo's guys are tossing the warehouse district. They found the diner. Cops are treating it like a mob war. Vincent is playing the grieving uncle to the bosses, saying you got caught in the crossfire." "He's a terrible actor," Dominic grunted. He looked at Nora. "We need to go. Grab the clothes." Silvio tossed a bundle of dark fabric onto the foot of the bed. Sweatpants, a heavy black hoodie. Uncomplicated clothing for a man who couldn't lift his left arm. Nora moved on autopilot. She grabbed the bottle of saline and the gauze. "I have to take off the temporary bandages," she said, her voice flat professional in a way that surprised her. "It's going to bleed again." "Just do it," Dominic commanded, his eyes locking onto the stained ceiling. She cut the ruined polyester strips with the broken razor blade. The smell of old blood hit the air again, heavy and cloying. Silvio stepped forward, his face grim, and poured the sterile saline directly into the jagged wound. Dominic didn't scream this time. He bit down on his own bottom lip until blood welled his entire body, going rigid against the mattress. Nora packed the fresh gauze tight, her fingers slipping in the wetness, pushing down the revulsion. She taped it heavily, wrapping medical tape across his chest and back in thick, constricting bands. It wasn't surgery. It was a patch job meant to buy hours, not days. "Let's move," Silvio said, hauling Dominic up by his right arm. Dominic swayed, his face completely drained of color, but he stayed on his feet. He shrugged into the oversized hoodie, wincing as the fabric scraped against the fresh tape. Nora stood by the door, her hands stained red once again. She watched them move toward the exit. Silvio opened the door, scanning the empty parking lot. "You," Dominic said, stopping in the doorway. He turned his head, his dark eyes fixing on Nora. "You drive," Silvio frowned, looking from his boss to the waitress. "Dom, I can take you to the safe house." "No." Dominic cut him off, his voice absolute. "You go back. You play dumb. You keep eyes on Vincent and find out where Leo is hiding. You don't know where I am." He reached into his pocket and tossed a set of silver key fobs to Nora. She caught them clumsily against her chest. "Get in the car," Dominic told her. Nora looked at the keys, then at the grey Audi waiting in the fog. She could turn around. She could walk back into the motel room, lock the door, and wait for the shift manager at Carmine's to fire her for a no-show. But the $10,000 was a heavy brick in her pocket, and the blood on her hands was already drying. She stepped out into the freezing mist, the gravel crunching beneath her cheap rubber shoes. She walked to the driver's side of the Audi and opened the door. The leather interior smelled like new cars and money. She slid into the seat, the engine vibrating through the steering wheel, a low, powerful promise of speed. Dominic collapsed into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut. He slumped against the window, exhausted, broken, but alive. "Put it in drive, Nora," he murmured, his eyes already closing. "And don't stop until we hit the state line." Nora shifted the gear. The car pulled forward, leaving the Pines Motor Lodge and the shattered, stolen sedan behind, vanishing into the heavy grey fog of the interstate.